Final Fantasy XII on the PS2 has always been infamous for just how brutal and unforgiving it is to speedrun. It's a run that's only recommended for the biggest masochists out there, as it has one of the lowest rates of completion within the series, where even if runners try to finish without resetting for every little mistake, less than 10% of runs still end up finishing. Not because of any RNG bottlenecks or frame perfect glitches, but because the speedrun is just that hard. You may think this is an exaggeration given the game's robust gambit system where you can program the party to automatically attack, heal, and even take advantage of enemy weaknesses, letting the game practically play itself, but you couldn't be further from the truth. Speedrunners cut no corners when it comes to beating a game as fast as possible, and Final Fantasy XII speedrunners take it to the extreme. And there's no single thing that makes this speedrun so hard. It's a combination of 5 main factors that all lead to making this such a ruthless speedrun. The first reason has to do with gambits. I briefly touched on them earlier, but gambits are a way to program your party members to take actions on their own. Because Final Fantasy XII is designed like a single-player MMO, the combat system gives players full control of a character's movements, but in exchange, it becomes so much more unreasonable to control multiple characters at once. Having to manually cast spells with each and every character, especially when the game expects you to kill so many enemies along the way, becomes very tedious. So the solution was to create the gambit system so that your allies take actions automatically, but based on your own criteria, and not some arbitrary metric the developers deem good enough. Gambits are of course used in a speedrun because they can offload some of the actions speedrunners need to take. But the issue is that going into the gambit menu to change a character's gambits takes time. For actions that are taken often and cost time to perform, gambits are created to save time, but speedrunners are very stingy when it comes to gambit usage because there are many places where the time it takes to add an extra gambit is just not worth it. And combat is not as simple as speedrunners just standing still and manually inputting commands either. There are many points in the speedrun where speedrunners have to run to their next destination while manually inputting commands for their party to set up for an upcoming fight. This means they are using the D-pad for menu inputs as well as the left joystick for movement, and you can't have your thumb be in both positions at the same time. And as if that wasn't bad enough, runners also have a time limit as well, because taking too long can cause buffs to run out earlier than they should. As a result, speedrunners have to find some way they can hold a controller that lets them use both the joystick and the D-pad at the same time, and still input commands quickly. This leads to issue number 2. Just like with most ATB Final Fantasies, this game has an active time mode and a wait time mode. In wait time, the game pauses while the skill menu is open, which gives players time to think and pick out their actions. In active time, the game is always running outside of the main menu. While wait time sounds more reasonable to do and is perfectly fine for newer runners, at some point the training wheels need to come off and runners have to play on active time for most of the game to save time. There are only a few exceptions where a fight is so tight that even top runners will go into wait time for, but the overwhelming majority of the game is done in active time. As the game progresses, the stakes get higher and higher, not just because of the time already invested into the speedrun and the fear of losing out on hours of a run, but also because the fights generally get harder and harder as the game progresses. Of course, these two are ultimately optional bits of optimization that runners can opt into. Runners always have the choice of making the run easier by just relying on gambits more and playing on wait mode. But that doesn't change the fact that the strategies themselves have a lot of room for error as well, which brings us to our third reason, Traveler. Traveler is a skill that does damage based on how many steps you've taken, and it's a major part of a handful of boss strategies. Since it's based on steps, this must mean the more steps you take, the more damage you do, right? Wrong! Traveler is another one of those random gimmicky mechanics that the game tells you nothing about. It works based on intervals of 1000 steps that you take. If you've taken between 0 to 99 steps, You deal that number of steps worth of damage for a maximum of 99 damage to all enemies in a range. If you've taken 100 to 499 steps, you deal 2 times your step count to all enemies for a maximum of 998 damage. If you've taken 500 to 989 steps, you deal 3 times the steps worth of damage for a maximum of 2,967 damage. But if you've taken from 990 to 999 steps, you deal 10 times the steps worth of damage for 9,900 to 9,990 damage to all enemies in range. That's just under the damage limit to every enemy in a small area, which is a lot for a large portion of the run. And the skill is used in quite a few places in order to beat bosses as quickly as possible. But the issue is that you only have a range of 10 steps total where you hit over 9,000 damage. Once you take your 1,000th step, the counter resets so you will do 0 damage. If runners take even just 1 step more or 1 step less, these fights that have been meticulously routed with Traveler in mind suddenly become a nightmare to recover from. In the case where runners overstep outside of a fight, they need to spend 15 minutes running around in circles, making up the 900 plus steps they need because Traveler is just that important. If runners overstep inside a fight though, that is where things will get messy. It's not easy to make up the damage lost, so they'll have to improvise on the fly to survive the fight and defeat the boss with the limited resources they have. This is a big deal on its own because of how late runners get Traveler and just how important it is. But it's not the worst part of the run. It is a far cry from the main strategy of the speedrun, which leads us to our 4th reason, the Reflect strategy. This is the bread and butter of the speedrun and is used against the vast majority of boss fights. The Reflect status makes spells bounce off a character and land on that character's nearest enemy. This means if an enemy casts a spell like Fire on one of your reflected allies, that spell will bounce off and hit the nearest enemy. If you have an ally cast Fire on a reflected ally, it will also bounce onto the nearest enemy and not to your own party. Likewise, the same applies for healing spells. So if you try to heal a reflected ally, the spell bounces off and heals the nearest enemy. This may sound useless, and in older Final Fantasies, it is definitely a niche spell with very few uses. But Final Fantasy XII made a major change that makes Reflect an absurdly overpowered spell, and it has to do with the way multi-target spells work. While some spells only target one character, spells such as Arrow, Fira, and Thundaga target all enemies within a certain range to take advantage of the pseudo-MMO style of combat, and there is no penalty for attacking multiple enemies in one spell cast. Most of the time, bosses are by themselves, so when you use these spells, you only hit them once. On the other hand, you always have at least 3 party members with you in every fight. You might see where this is going. Instead of casting spells on an enemy normally, speedrunners cast Reflect on their entire party. They then go into battle casting spells on their party and have those get reflected onto the enemies. With 3 party members, that's 3 whole copies of a spell on a single target, dealing 3 times more damage than simply casting the spell normally. This is already a huge advantage over attacking a boss, and this doesn't factor in enemy weaknesses which doubles damage taken, the oil status which triples fire damage taken, or the fact that elemental staves passively boost damage of a specific element by 50%. Seriously, why doesn't the game say anything about this feature? Needless to say, this strategy is extremely overpowered, but it is nowhere as simple as it sounds. There's a lot more that goes on than simply reflecting your party and casting spells on them. The main issue stems from time and MP. Casting magic is expensive, and your characters only have so much MP to spend. Sure, you can run around in circles to restore your MP in this game, but besides the fact that it costs time to do so, enemies are also attacking the party, so you will have to waste more resources healing up your party while you're running around like a hamster. And to make matters worse, Reflect doesn't last very long. By default, it only lasts 60 seconds and it costs 12 MP to cast again. So you will have to regain all the MP needed for spells, plus more for the reflect casts as well. And to top it all off, the amount of MP needed for defeating monsters is absurd. I mean, just look at this. Arrow costs 16 MP, but the runners only have about 180 MP total between Ash and Penelo about 1/3 of the way through the game. Runners already grind a lot as it is, but they just don't have enough MP to spend on fights without having to waste time healing up at save crystals. And even if runners did have enough MP, they still have to deal with this. Yeah, not fun. Bosses have these cutscene attacks they use at various HP thresholds. So the only way to survive is to defeat the boss before it can use it, which just doesn't work out without an absurd amount of damage. So the reflect strategy is worthless on its own. Speedrunners need some more firepower in order to defeat bosses fast enough, and the solution is one of the biggest reasons why this strategy makes the speedrun so absurdly difficult. There is a skill you can learn in the game called Spellbreaker. While Spellbreaker is active, your magic stat gets doubled, which effectively doubles the amount of damage you deal with magic. This is yet another absurdly powerful tool that speedrunners get, and it is the reason why speedrunners are able to beat every single boss without running out of MP. But the cost of using such a powerful skill is steep. Spellbreaker isn't just active by default. It's a passive ability that only works if you have less than 20% HP. That's right, 20% HP. Speedrunners have to play almost the entire game while their spellcasters, the ones who do all the heavy lifting, are constantly one hit away from dying. And let me tell you, it is not easy keeping them alive all the time. By the way, if a character dies, they lose all their status effects, so that means goodbye reflect. This means that any deaths during fights are a disaster. This leads to our fifth and worst reason for the speedrun's difficulty, which is the most important skill for any Final Fantasy XII speedrunner: improvising. Between everything we've talked about so far, there's just so many ways for a run to screw over runners. Often it's just a skill issue, but in some cases the game just decides to say fuck you and find ways to ruin a run. Unlike in the fancy new Zodiac Age version of the game, the original PS2 version of Final Fantasy XII does not have autosaves. If a runner gets a game over, they will have to reload their last save, if they even made one at all in the run. Saving is extremely inconvenient in the speedrun, especially once runners reach a certain skill level. Remember, the fights are done with the girls in critical HP, and touching a save crystal forcefully heals the entire party. So every extra save crystal means having to redo any setup bringing the girls back into critical HP, which wastes a decent chunk of time. Not only that, but dungeons are routed very meticulously in some areas, so reflect timings are very important. If runners are too slow, the reflect can run out, and saving in between means they have to kill the party to remove reflect, heal up, and then redo all the setups again. Plus, saving on its own is really slow. I mean, just look at this. GTA 6 is going to release before this memory card even finishes loading. Even if runners do grab every convenient save point along the way, getting a game over can mean losing anywhere between a few minutes to almost an hour, depending on which boss they died at. So they really do not want to die. This makes recovering from deaths a massive part of the speedrun. Very few runs already finish as is, and even the world record got hit with some bad luck that could have ended the run. Trying to get even a remotely respectable time in FF12 without learning how to properly recover from deaths is effectively impossible. So how do runners recover from deaths? In a run, the formation revolves around Vaughn as a tank, while Ash and Penelo are the two spellcasters. If one of the girls dies, runners will have to bring her to life with an item called a Phoenix Down. This brings a character to life with 20% of their HP, which is just outside of Spellbreaker range. Runners then have to get one of the girls to smack her with her staff to bring her under 20% HP, while the other casts Reflect on herself, and possibly on the other as well if too much time has passed. And then there's fights later on where Vaughn needs a very short duration buff called Lure that lasts 20 seconds by default, and which has a high chance of missing if the caster Ashe does not have Spellbreaker active. By the way, while recovering from fights, the enemies can kill the girls again or possibly even Vaughn, which makes things even tougher because oh boy is it fun trying to recover when you have to rely on your other 3 party members, Bosch, Balthier, and Fran, when they are even more underleveled than the main party already is. Recovering from deaths requires a ton of improvisation. There's no universal strategy that works for every fight. It's just a general method with tens if not hundreds of variations that speedrunners have individually come up with for different situations. So it's a run that very much tests your ability to think on the fly. You only have so many items on you to revive and heal your party, and that amount also changes depending on your luck with money throughout the run. So you could have a lucky run one day, but then get screwed over the next and have to get by with far less items than usual. It's truly a speedrun where only the biggest of masochists should ever consider touching.